Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Fatal Attraction. Today we're talking about the tragic life of Travis Alexander. I want to make a full disclosure that in the story that we're talking about today, a lot of people that would cover this story would reference this story to a film that would come out in 1987 entitled Fatal Attraction. The movie would star actor Michael Douglas and Glenn Close. The film is about a successful lawyer named Daniel who has a very lustful affair with a woman named Alex, who is a bookkeeper. And shortly after the lustful affair, he breaks things off with the mistress to begin working on his family and rebuilding his relationship with his wife. And Alex doesn't take the breakup very well and begins stalking Daniel and his entire family. And she would even go as far to following his wife and daughter around, breaking into the home, and even going as far as taking the family pet rabbit and boiling it. And going as far to kidnapping Daniel and his wife's daughter. Essentially, Daniel will go and take matters into his own hands after Alex would kidnap his daughter and killing her. And unlike this movie, the story I'm about to tell you today does not have a happy ending. All things considered, if you really don't think about the tragic end that Travis would have, he was a very inspirational person and is living proof that you could come from the worst kind of child abuse or any kind of abusive surrounding environment and just rise above that. And it's really tragic to see that Travis Alexander ended up having the end that he had. Travis Alexander would be one of 8 children born on July 28, 1977. His parents, Pamela and Gary Alexander, would be extremely dependent on various drugs, more specifically crystal meth. Travis Alexander would make a quote later on in his life that he had a very normal childhood. That is, a normal childhood with any child with drug-dependent parents. Travis would later say that his father was really never in the picture due to drugs, and would also say that his mother had the potential to being a good mother, but because of poor decisions in her life, was never capable of doing so. As she progressively became more dependent on drugs, she became less capable of raising her children. Travis would also make the statement that himself and his siblings would grow up in poverty most of their life. And because their mother was often passed out from drugs, a lot of the kids and siblings had to fend for themselves. And because Pamela was often passed out from drugs, the kids would often have to provide for themselves meals and different things like that. And a lot of the food that they were able to eat were mostly rotten food that they would find behind the refrigerator, mostly because a lot of them were too young to operate or use a can opener. Travis would recall one incident where he would have to take some bread behind the refrigerator that was actually covered in mold, and he would begin eating it, and was often teased because they would have canned food but have no knowledge of how to use a can opener. And a lot of times the kids, because they grew up in poverty, would not bathe, so they had a tendency of not smelling very well or stinking. And it wasn't because they couldn't bathe or they just didn't want to bathe, but it was more so because the kids were very afraid of bathing. Travis would recall one time when he had taken a bath and he had gotten a little bit of water on the floor, and his mother would wake up from a drunken or drug-induced stupor and would actually accuse him of peeing on the floor and throwing him halfway through a wall. And because they grew up poor, Travis would say that he was often bullied in school, but the insults that the kids would throw at him and his sisters would pale to the insults and treatment that he would receive from his mother, Pamela. Travis would describe Pamela as being a very abusive person, regularly beating himself and his sisters. and would recall one time standing out and screaming at God, begging to have his grandmother come pick him and his sisters up, to where Pamela would wake up from a drug comatose state and beat Travis for waking her up and going back to sleep. And after she would go back to sleep, Travis would continue screaming at God, begging God again to have his grandmother come and pick them up and take them away. And ironically, on that day, Travis's grandmother would come inside the house, walk right past they passed out Pamela, and take himself and his sisters to her house while Pamela laid on the couch passed out. Travis and his sisters would have a very back and forth type of upbringing with Pamela and their grandparents. A lot of times the grandparents would come and take the kids to their house to where they could stay, while Pamela was addicted to drugs and would basically make Pamela try to get her life together. Pamela would try to get her life together, but she could never ever just get rid of her addiction to drugs, and would always get back into the same system of being on drugs, to where Travis's grandparents would pick the kids up and take them to their house. Travis would say that the closest thing to a normal child upbringing he had were the times and the summers that he spent with his great-grandfather and his grandparents. Travis would talk about the summers he had with his great-grandfather, where during this time, Travis and his siblings would have a very good childhood, or just a glimpse or a taste of what a normal childhood was. He would say that they often played outside, or his grandfather would take them on walks, or himself, his siblings, and his great-grandfather would play board games around the house. They would eat pizza and just have a really good time, and was just kind of a good break from their lifestyle they would have when they were at home with Pamela. And during the summers when the kids were at Travis's great-grandfather's house, he would also teach them to read and write, and it would always be nonstop laughter. And whenever Pamela would arrive to pick the kids up from the great-grandfather's house, Travis would recall that before leaving, Travis's great-grandfather would bring him in for a very warm embrace hug and hold him tight, and would then grab him by both shoulders and telling Travis, listen, you're a very special boy. You can do anything you put your mind to. Don't forget that you're extremely special. Which honestly was completely polar opposite of how Pamela talked and treated Travis, where almost on a daily basis, Pamela would remind not only Travis, but the rest of his siblings that they made her completely miserable and that every one of her kids had ruined her life. And if that wasn't bad enough, she would take her fists and beat them over the back and the head with her fists. Travis would recall that every single time Pamela would insult him and say that it was his fault that her life was so horrible, he would just close his eyes and think about the words of his grandfather and talk about how special he was. And every single time his mother would beat him over the head or beat him over the back with her fist, he would close his eyes again and think about the days of the summer of his great-grandfather and remind himself that was not his mom beating him, but that was his great-grandfather pulling him in for a hug. Travis would make the quote that while Pamela would do this, he refused to let Pamela steal or rob him of whatever was special inside of him. By the time Travis was 11 years old, he would run away from Pamela's house and run to his grandparents' home. And he would tell his grandparents that he was sick and tired of living with Pamela, and he was going to be living with them from now on. And shortly after he had ran away to his grandparents, the rest of his siblings would follow suit. Travis would make a statement quoting Abraham Lincoln, "Everything I am and everything I owe to my angel grandmother."